that now so I don't forget. My intentions are always good. It's just if I can remember. Alan, good morning to you. How are you? I don't know whether they can unmute or not, but just showing my appreciation for everyone being here. I see Anna from Central Appraisal District is with us. That's good. Good morning, Anna. John, good morning to you. Mr. Parkhouse, good morning to you too. And of course, good morning to Brandy.
Morning, everybody.
Ah, there we go. Good morning, Christine. All right. Well, Clint, it's 10:02. Maybe we'll have some folks just tuning in, here in the next few minutes or so. But I guess in efforts to keep with good timing, we'll just go ahead and begin. Clint, you're ready to roll, I guess, as I assume. Is that right?
I'm ready to go.
Good deal. Well, let's go ahead and kick it off. It's approximately 10:02. Welcome, everyone, or good morning, should I say. It's a beautiful morning. Wow, we've had some wonderful weather, haven't we? And I know we're kind of in a dry spell, which is good. I guess it's better than wading through waters. And so that's always good, but certainly a blessing to be here this morning. And we want to welcome Mr. Clint Foss with Texas Parks and Wildlife. He's our area biologist for regional biologist for Fort Wayne County and Wharton counties, and just a wonderful gentleman to give us some really good information on part 2 of a 2-part series with agricultural and wildlife appraisal. The differences in between the two, and if you have an interest in doing that or just to find out about it. But Mr. Foss is absolutely, in my opinion, the man to give you the information that you need to know, and just a wealth of knowledge. And we are very blessed to have him in the same office as us. And so, Clint, I don't want to steal all the thunder. There's no way I can. Because you've got it. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to hand it over to, and pardon me, 2 more things. If you do have questions along the way, I'll be watching the chat box, Clint, as well. So if you have questions, type them in, and I would assume probably even at the end of the program, if you want to unmute, which I believe it gives you the ability to do that, then there'll be a question and answer time at the end of the program as well, if you just want to unmute and speak. But other than that, just type in your questions, and Clint, I'll be watching the chat box for you, and okay. if questions start coming in, I'll slip in and say, hey, Clint, we got a question about this before we get too much further down the line. Okay.
Sure. Yep.
All right, Mr. Foss, it is all yours. Take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Philip. Again, my name is Clint Foss, Parks and Wildlife biologist, covers Wharton and Fort Wayne counties. Been in this position for about coming up on almost exactly 3 years now. So let me share my screen.
Perfect. I'm assuming everyone can see that. I can see it. I know that.
Okay. I'll go ahead and leave my camera on. I apologize if it looks like I'm not looking at you all. I've got 2 monitors, and the monitor I'm looking at's over here. So let's get kicked off for wildlife tax valuation. A little background on it. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of depth on some of this stuff because it's things that Ben would have covered already. But the wildlife tax valuation falls into open space ag appraisals. It's improperly referred to as an exemption. A lot of times it's not an exemption. There's still taxes that are there. It's just a wildlife appraisal. And so, again, it falls into open space agricultural appraisals, the 1D1 chapter or subchapters there. That includes traditional agricultural use and wildlife use. So this is the wildlife tax valuation. Prior to 1995, traditional ag use was the only one that was available. Proposition 11, so you may hear me refer to it as Prop 11. You may hear me refer to it as 1D1 or wildlife tax valuation. But Prop 11, it allowed agricultural appraisal for land use to manage for wildlife. This was approved by voters in 95. So this allowed people to obtain that open space valuation specifically for wildlife management. So they didn't have to have that traditional ag component in there. When you do this, you carry over the same tax rate that you had with the agricultural use. And so if you were row crop, you carried that over. If you were rangeland, you carried that over. If you were hay, you carried that over. So ultimately what this allows you to do is help wildlife and hopefully help the land that you're managing as well. And so there are some financial benefits to this as opposed to no valuation at all. When we compare the two, we've got fair market value, and we've got production value. And when we're on this agricultural valuation, it's based off this production value. And so for a landowner, the benefits there can potentially be some pretty large savings. We don't want people to step into this wildlife valuation only with that saving in mind. We want people to step into it because they do want to manage their land for wildlife. We want it to be better. We want people to do something that makes their land better for the wildlife that they're managing. You do currently have to be under agricultural appraisal for 5 years. That can include livestock, forage production, hay, farming. It can include timber production. I doubt that we have anything in this county that's under timber production, but in the eastern parts of the state, we do have that as an option. You cannot transfer from wildlife to wildlife tax valuation from a 1D appraisal, but I'm not sure that we have anything in the county that's currently under a 1D appraisal, and so that may not be applicable. There is a minimum acreage requirement. If you're transferring over from ag to wildlife, the minimum acreage equals acreage at which agricultural use was approved. So this varies by county and landscape. But if you carried that valuation over, then that minimum acreage should carry over with what you were already at, except when the tract was reduced in size during the tax year prior to applying for conversion to wildlife tax valuation. And so if the property was split, let's say you had 20 acres that qualified for agricultural, the agricultural tax valuation, and it was split into two 10-acre sections, those 10-acre sections probably would not qualify for wildlife use requirements. This varies by county. It's set. I don't remember off the top of my head what our minimum acreage exactly is. There's a number, but I can get back with you all on that if that applies to, if that's a question that you have that applies to your situation. The primary use for wildlife, it must be, the primary use of the property must be wildlife management, such that a couple of things here. The tract of land is actively being managed to sustain a breeding, migrating, or wintering population of indigenous wildlife. So let's start with the breeding population. So if you've got 10 acres and you're trying to manage for white-tailed deer, it's not to say that you can't do beneficial things for deer on that 10-acre tract of land, but you can't sustain a breeding population on that piece of property. And so this comes into play when we're talking about what we're managing, how we're managing it, and the practices that we're choosing, which we'll get into later. Migrating populations, so let's say you're managing for waterfowl. They're not going to be there year-round. They're either going to be migrating through where they're going to be wintering populations. And so it has to be populations that are on this property for a set period of time and for a set purpose, and it has to be indigenous wildlife. You can't manage your property for axis deer because they're non-native. They're introduced. They can be problematic species. There's a whole lot of stuff out there that you can't manage for, but as long as you stick to the indigenous, the native wildlife populations, then you should be good to go. It also says that the indigenous wildlife population must be produced for human use, including food, medicine, or recreation. Again, we'll talk about this some more in a minute, but it has to be some sort of use, but it doesn't have to be a consumptive use. You don't have to manage for hunting, medicinal use. It could be plants, but that recreation side, you can manage this for pure recreation value. You can manage it for bird watching and things like that, but you still have to meet those requirements that manage that property for that species or those species of animals. Property can still be managed for secondary uses such as grazing. However, those secondary uses cannot interfere with the wildlife management practices, and they cannot be detrimental to the wildlife species targeted for management. So there's a picture of a cow on here. If you continue to graze your property, you can use grazing as one of your practices we'll talk about in a minute. However, if you're managing that property for ground nesting birds and you graze it to where there's little to no grass left, then you're actually causing a detriment to that species or to that group of animals rather than causing a beneficial practice out of it. So that's just something to keep in mind, that it can't be detrimental to the species you're trying to manage. And so on the application process, there's some things to think about ahead of time. The step one is to identify your target species and management practices. So you need to figure out what you want to manage for, whether that's songbirds, whether that's deer, turkey, quail, any number of things. Pollinators can be on there. So you need to pick what that is. It needs to be an indigenous wildlife species, and it needs to be relevant to your property. If you own property in Fort Bend County without a single pine tree on it, you can't say that you're going to manage for red cockaded woodpeckers because we don't have them here. We don't have the habitat for them here. So it has to be relevant to what you're doing and where you're located. There's some things that you need to think about. So what is the current status of the property? Is it in a poor state that you're trying to bring it back up to the standard or up to a quality area for wildlife, or is it already in pretty good condition and the practices that you're doing are just kind of maintaining that? What are your goals and what are the animals that you want to target? So you should have goals for your property when it comes to wildlife management. You should determine what you want to get out of it before you even start it. You also need to think about, what do the target animals require to thrive? Again, using the woodpecker example, if you don't have that specific thing that these animals may need, then you may not be able to manage it, and it wouldn't be a good goal for yourself or for your property. And lastly, what management practices will meet your goals and help the targeted animals thrive? So again, all this is setting into place. It's a thought process before you even start down this journey. Next is the management practices. So you'll have to fulfill at least 3 of the following 7 categories. We're going to talk about these in depth in a little bit, but just know that you've got 7 different categories, 7 options here, and you have to hit at least 3 of them in any given year. So on your management practices, there are multiple practices that can fit into each category. Again, we'll cover this in just a second. Just know that even though you may hit 3 practices, if they all fall in the same category, you're only going to get credit for one of those categories. And so it'll make more sense as we start to go through it. They must comply with the set of rules published in the Comprehensive Wildlife Management Planning Guide. I will show you where to find that, and I can also provide a link or a copy of that for you. So you'll complete your wildlife management plan. This is something that me as a biologist in the county can help you with. However, I don't usually put everything into the plan for people, because ultimately it's your property, it's your goals, it's your resources, and so I don't know exactly what you have to be able to put these things into place. If I write a plan that is not an attainable goal for a piece of property, then the plan is for the most part, it's worthless, because if you can't put those goals into practice, then there's nothing in that plan that's beneficial. So there's check boxes, it's fill in the blank, it's an expandable form. Again, these are things that can be found on the Parks and Wildlife website that I'll show you in just a second. So step 3 is your actual application for the agricultural use appraisal. This is a screenshot that I took just a little while ago. I think if you can see my mouse here, you'll look on the main homepage. If you scroll down just a little bit, you'll see the agricultural appraisal link. And this is something that Ben had talked about, so I'm just going to kind of skip across this. You'll submit it to your tax appraisal or your central appraisal district office by April 30th of that year. Step 5, implement the selected practices. And so after you go through all these steps, you figure out what you want to do, you put it into a management plan. Your next step is to actually implement these things. So again, you have to implement 3 of the 7 practices by end of the current tax year. The law does not require you to be successful either in traditional agri and wildlife management. It requires that you meet the criteria for each practice and demonstrate that you've made a good faith effort. That's not to say that if you put a practice and you say, well, I tried to burn, but I never could burn. Well, in that case, you didn't actually put fire on the ground. If you went out and you tried to put fire on the ground and it was a poor burn and it didn't consume everything, then you still put good faith effort forward, and you still attempted to put that practice into play. You'll see on the far left side is a wood duck box. If you put up the boxes, the saying, if you build it, they will come. Well, sometimes they don't come right away. So if you put the box up, you made everything possible to make this, to provide this supplemental shelter for these wildlife species, and they don't show up. That's not your fault that they're not using it, but you did put the box up. You did everything that you could to make it successful. Same goes with the small picture of the tractor here. If you go out and you plant native grasses, it may be 2 or 3 years before you see the results of that planting. And so just because you prepped it and you put the seed in the ground, because the grass didn't come up, doesn't mean that it's not successful. It may be either delayed, or it may be that there was some environmental condition that made it not come up that year. And so the fact that you put it in the ground, the fact that you made a good faith effort to make that practice work is the first step. And step 6 is to enjoy it. Another quote that you've heard already: it must be produced for human use, including food, medicine, or recreation. Remember, that does not have to be consumptive use. You see 2 birders up here in the picture. You see some really cool habitat on the bottom right that could be for, gosh, that could be for deer or turkey or quail or pollinators. So it could work for anything, but it doesn't have to be a consumptive use. You don't have to hunt the property or collect anything off the property. It can be for ecotourism, it can be for birding, it can be for the benefit of the species. But as long as the people that are using it in some way, and that can include recreation. So on the Parks and Wildlife website, this is a little bit of an older look at our website here, but it's still the same thing. If you go to our main homepage, tpwd.state.tx.us, I think that's tpwd.texas.gov now. But if you select the land link under private lands, you'll see this agricultural tax appraisal based on wildlife management. Selecting that link brings you more information than you could ever want to read about the evaluation process. There's some legal stuff that you can find on here. That wildlife management planning guideline that I mentioned a while ago, we're in the Gulf Prairies and Marshes region. And so you would select this document. It's a couple hundred pages long that you can weed through. Again, I am extremely happy to help anybody with this process, answer any questions that you may have about this process, because you can get pretty far into the weeds on some of this stuff and not make sense of it. And so I'd be very happy to help you with anything that you may need. If you do own property in different parts of the state, Post Oak, Savannah, and Blackland Prairies to our north, South Texas Plains to our south, west and southwest, anywhere in the state, you're going to have a little bit different guidelines. I'll share with y'all in just a second. I do have a document for the Gulf Prairies and Marshes and the Post Oak, Savannah, and Blackland Prairies that outlines your minimum acreage requirements for a lot of these practices. And so some things may say 10 acres or 10% of the property, whichever is less. Some things say 1% of the property or 10 acres, whichever is more. So it just depends on the specific practices that you're doing, but there are minimum acreage requirements for a lot of these things, or minimum practice requirements. And so let me pause for just a second there. Philip, did we have any questions that popped up, or do y'all have any questions for that section before I move into these management practices? I don't have the chat.
Sorry, Clint. I'm
That's
still
okay.
I'm having technical issues, but I'm back with you. Sorry, folks. So far, I think we're good. So far,
Okay.
We are clear and ready to go.
Excellent. And so I'm going to go through all of these practices. I say all, is more than just 7, because each one has things in that category. But remember that you have to hit 3 of these 7 categories in any given year. I usually recommend to people, if you have more things, let's say you put 4 of them on there, that can be a good thing. If you can hit those 4 practices in any given year, that's great, but you only have to have 3. The thing that I discourage from is putting too many of them on there, because if you put 10 things on there and you accomplish 10, that's great. But if you put 10 things and you only accomplish 3, it doesn't look like you're actually reaching your goals. And so I usually tell people, put 3 if you know you can do 3, put 4 if you need a backup. Within each of these practices, you can put multiple things. And let's say you may hit prescribed burning one year and brush control the next. And so you can kind of change it around like that. But let's step into it. The first one is grazing management. I've talked about it briefly already. You can get up to 2 years deferment credit for your grazing practices. But after that, you either have to put cattle back on or you can't claim that anymore. There are multiple benefits to grazing. One is that it can rebuild vegetation. You can maintain your grass density. If you have too much grass, or if you have a really thick thatch layer like you see on the bottom right, it can help open that land back up, open the soil back up, and actually encourage plant growth through grazing and through hoof action. There are some considerations to it. It can be one of these secondary uses. Again, if you're specifically managing for wildlife, it doesn't mean that you cannot graze. It doesn't mean that you cannot. It just means that you have to watch how you do or tweak those practices so that they are beneficial to wildlife. There are various grazing systems that you can put into place. Depends on your pasture, depends on the number of cross fences you have and the number of cattle that you are grazing. There's not a minimum grazing density when you go into the wildlife management side of things. We look at it more as, how can I graze this to be beneficial to the wildlife or to meet my goals? The biggest thing that I try to keep in mind with grazing is that it needs to be grazing management and it needs to be beneficial. If your entire place looks like the pasture that's on the left-hand side, you've not created an environment that's conducive to, say, ground nesting birds or other things. And so when you put grazing into your plan, it doesn't simply mean that you have cattle. It means that you're trying to actively manage your grazing for the benefit of these wildlife species. Another one, and let me step back up. Again, this is in the habitat management section, and you'll see as we go through, we've got erosion control, predator control, providing supplemental food and water, shelter, and then performing census or survey counts. And so prescribed burning is another one. You can use it with or without grazing. Some of the benefits from prescribed burning, it does remove the thatch layer. Again, that dead layer that's just there. It may be choking out some other plant species. It may be just old grass that's just hanging around, just laying there that you can consume with fire, and it kind of restarts everything. So it does stimulate plant growth, and it can manage grass and brush. There's a lot of considerations for burning. In fact, we could have a whole day presentation just talking about this practice. But some of the things that you need to think about is planning and safety, making a burn plan, thinking about how you're going to burn, where you're going to burn. One of the biggest things about fire management is smoke management, especially in areas like us, where we've got a lot of people around, a lot of houses, a lot of roads. So there's a lot of things to think about actively putting fire on the ground. Another one is exotic grasses. If you are overrun with exotic grasses, you can actually promote them with fire instead of suppressing them with fire. And so timing of doing your fires and how you approach that, it can vary. There are some chemical applications that you can do prior to burning that may help you with some of these exotic grasses as well. When it comes to burning, it's one that varies greatly across the board, whether you're in South Texas, the Edwards Plateau, Blackland Prairies, or Post Oak Savannah, or if you're down here in our area. So speaking specifically of the Gulf Prairies and Marshes region, if you are in coastal marshes and you're using prescribed burning, the requirement is at a minimum of 33% of the total acreage to be burned. In wooded uplands, it's 15%. Rangelands, it's 20%. And so wherever you're going to apply that practice, that's dictated, or your minimums are dictated by where you're applying that practice. We've got range enhancement, so that is reseeding. It's actually replanting stuff that's out there. It has to be done with native plants. You can't go back in and claim range enhancement if you're planting Bermuda grass back out on the pasture, or you're introducing some non-native species, non-native grass. It helps to meet food and cover requirements for wildlife. Again, depending on the species that you're targeting, would be depending on what plant species you focus on. It can be a costly practice, upwards of $150 per acre, and that's including the prep and planting only, not any of the stuff that comes after that. it is one that requires 10% of the designated area or 10 acres annually, whichever is less. And so, again, if you've got 200 acres and you can get away with just doing, you could get away with just doing 10 acres of that property. It's an excellent practice, especially in areas that may be prior ag lands that are converted back over, or areas that were, let's say, if you have a hay meadow that you are now trying to convert back over to wildlife use. This can be an excellent practice. Just know that it is a somewhat costly practice, and it's not one that you always see results from right away. Sometimes it takes time to see the results from that. Under brush and tree management, so a couple things on this one. It's looking at it from two different ways. One is maintaining invading brush species, so that does not have to be non-native. It can be mesquite, it can be juniper, it can be grapevine. It can be things that are taking over on the landscape, yaupon in this area. But it can also be planting. It can also be encouraging woody plant growth if you're in an area that doesn't have any and you're trying to get that back. And so it's the goal is to promote a balance of brush, grass, and forbs. You shape the brush to suit your wildlife needs. So if you're talking about brush removal, we no longer think about it as complete brush eradication rather than brush sculpting and making it look like you want the landscape to look like. It can be done through chemical, mechanical, biological controls. There's some concerns, not concerns, but some considerations for biological control, and not one that we see a lot down here. When we think about biological control, we think about using goats for ash juniper in the hill country and things like that. So not to say that there's not a purpose or not a place for biological controls down here, but most of the time with brush management, we're thinking about mechanical and chemical control. So sometimes that can be done with the idea of promoting new growth or planting. Let's say if we're talking about some mixed brush stuff down in South Texas and you run a roller chopper through it, some of the reasons for doing that can be to remove brush or remove brush density, and some of it can be to encourage regrowth and resprouting, because those are the more palatable, more nutritious plants to white-tailed deer. So it just depends on what your goals are and what you're trying to meet for that animal species. Under considerations, it's not always necessary. Sometimes you can control this stuff with fire or with other practices. Sometimes it's not necessarily a problem. Just because you have juniper on your property doesn't mean you have to get rid of it. Same with mesquite, but it can be problematic. Once you start, you can't stop. Follow-up is always key. There's another saying that says brush management is a process, not a project. It's not a one-time thing that you do and walk away from. It's something that you have to continue to go back on, and continue to follow up with. A good example is yaupon. If you go in with a mulcher, you can mulch through an area that's completely covered in yaupon, and you open it up and it looks amazing. However, if you don't go back in it in 2, 3, maybe 4 years, it's going to come back just as dense, if not more dense than it was before. And so you've basically accomplished nothing, and it's money down the drain. So you have to come back, you have to follow up with it. Under the minimum acreage requirement, it's 10% of the designated area or 10 acres annually, whichever is less. If you are planting trees and shrubs, it requires 150 trees or shrubs planted per acre per year for the designated area. I don't know that that's necessarily a hard and fast number, because there's some things we may not want to plant at that density, but remember that some of this is taking into account, what you may see in the eastern parts of the state. If you're going back in, you're replanting pines or something like that. Under fence modification, if you have complete net wire around your property that's impassable to, maybe a mature white-tailed deer can jump over it, but a white-tailed fawn couldn't, then you may be able to make fence modifications for that. This really comes into play if you're in the Trans-Pecos, or if you're in a panhandle and you're talking about pronghorn antelope and their inability to cross, or bighorn sheep and their inability to cross net wire fences. There's modifications that can be made to benefit those species. Under riparian management and enhancement, we'll talk some more about erosion control after a while, but preventing erosion is one thing. Remember that we're in the habitat management side of things, so you can do riparian management to protect important habitats. You can also do it to create habitat. If you're managing for waterfowl and you do not have a wetland on your property, you can go in, you can create these wetland type areas. You can protect your existing riparian areas. So there's different things that you can do to protect and enhance these riparian areas, these wetland type areas. Specifically on your riparian areas, you can get credit for just fencing those areas off. If you've got a creek and your cattle are constantly going down and watering at that creek, when instead, if you fence it off and they can go water at a water trough and preserve that riparian area, then you can get credit for fencing that off. You can defer grazing from it for a period of time, establishing vegetation to prevent erosion on those riparian areas. So there's a lot of things you can do, but protecting those riparian zones, or just buffering off of them a little ways to allow your wildlife to use it and not your cattle is a practice. Must implement one project every 10 years. So this is one that you can get credit for. If you put up a fence along a riparian area, you can get 10 years worth of credit for doing that. So it's not something that you have to do a new practice each and every year. Under wetland enhancement, I got a little bit ahead of myself on the previous slide, but creating habitat for water dependent species. So if you don't have a wetland and you create a wetland for waterfowl or shorebirds, again, it doesn't have to be consumptive use. You can do it for overwintering populations of shorebirds. You can do it for summer populations of shorebirds that are hanging out here and breeding here. That can be creating wetlands, that can be managing wetlands or maintaining wetlands, excluding grazing, providing water to those if you've got a well and you can pump something up that otherwise may or may not have water that year, and also planting and promoting native growth. If you have a pond that's 100% covered in cattail and you want to open it up, going in and treating that and maintaining that wetland, you can get credit for. If you do create one, it's another one that you can get 10 years worth of credit for. So that's a pretty interesting or pretty beneficial one from the standpoint of getting long-term credits for more bang for your buck, if you will. So habitat protection for species of concern. There has to be species of concern present on your property for this to be an issue. Again, I talked about the woodpeckers earlier, Texas horned lizard, golden cheek warbler, black-capped vireo. You can't manage your black-capped vireo down here because it's not a bird that we have that we're concerned about. It's found in the hill country. If you've got habitat for whooping cranes, if you've got habitat, there's another one that was recently popping up, the chicken turtle, that may be an example. There's some rail species, bird species that are found in marshes that you can help protect. And so there's species of greatest conservation need. If you have them on your property and you can specifically target that, then you can get those credits. But it's a very specific thing. It has to be present on the property, or has to be potentially present on the property for you to get credit for that. And so it'd be a case-by-case basis. Under prescribed control of native, exotic, or feral species, this can be vegetation or animals, Bermuda grass, juniper, mesquite, any number of things. It doesn't have to be exotic species like the juniper, like the mesquite, like huisach. It doesn't have to be a non-native. It can be a native that is growing outside of its range or growing at a greater density than we would like to see them. So you can get credit for treating that 10% of the designated area or 10 acres annually, whichever is less. Under animals, it can be feral pigs, it could be exotic deer. There's a lot of things on the animal side that you can potentially control for. If you're managing a small acreage property for songbirds and you have a feral cat population, trapping those feral cats in that area can count as one of those practices as well. And so it doesn't have to be things like pigs, but it can be. Under wildlife restoration, this kind of goes back to some of those species of greatest conservation needs, or in the picture you see a group of turkeys that are flying. It can be things like that. If you have an area that doesn't have turkeys in it, you have a large enough area that can help restore it. Or if you work with Parks and Wildlife on some of our reintroduction efforts, then you can potentially get credit for these practices of restoring wildlife to that area. Again, though, keep in mind that it is very situation dependent. It has to be something that we are currently in need of. It has to be something that we're currently allowing reintroduction efforts on in movement of those animals. Hay meadow pasture and cropland management for wildlife. So some of these, again, these secondary uses, if you have hay on your property, you don't have to stop haying it. However, if you postpone mowing or baling until after the peak of your ground nesting bird season, so after July 31st, you can get credit just for delaying the cutting of that hay until after your fawns have grown up enough to be out of the way, after your birds have hatched out and they're no longer using that nest space. You can do modifications like a wide bar on the front of your tractor that would be, moving across the ground before you get there, that would flush wildlife out so you don't accidentally run those over. Or if you're going to mow your property, maybe just mowing a portion of it each year, a third of it each year. It helps create edge and it leaves some of that habitat while still meeting your property goals of mowing it and keeping that maintained look. So minimize weed control in your pastures. If you are grazing it for wildlife, some people are going out there and they're spraying Grazon or whatever product out there on the landscape to minimize weeds. Well, those weeds are cover and they're food for the wildlife species that you're trying to manage for. So minimizing weed control or using some sort of no-till or minimum till that leaves vegetation out there on the ground for things to use. And so all this improves plant diversity. It benefits ground nesting birds, mammals, insects, a lot of different things just by tweaking the practices that you're already doing. So that all falls into habitat management. So again, 3 of these 7 practices in any given year, if you're hitting any one of those things under habitat management, then you can check that off for your year. If you're doing 2 or 3 of those things, you still only get credit for that one practice. However, like I said, if you're going to do brush work one year and you're going to do something else another year, you don't have to do that. You don't have to put fire on the ground every single year. If you put fire on the ground this year, you can count it. However, it needs to be built into your management plan if you're going to do those different things. So the next one is erosion control. We talked briefly about this, but you can do specific things to target erosion control. If you've got a highly eroding area and you create a pond there, if you do any sort of gully shaping, if it's already eroded and you reshape it and revegetate that area. Streamside pond and wetland revegetation, establishing native plants that help with the erosion, dike levee construction and management, or water diversions. And so this can look any number of ways, but again, if you're building a pond to get credit for erosion control, you need to show that you're doing it for erosion control. You do have a annual report at the end of the year, taking pictures to show what you're doing, to show why you're doing it. It all help to build your case that this is why you're doing these practices. So pond construction, repair, maybe you put in rock berms. You can see that this could be an erodible, or this is an eroded area right here. So putting in these rock berms to help slow that water down, to spread that water out, can help with erosion. You can also set hay bales at the top of a cut bank, if it's a small eroded cut bank, that can help slow that down. Ultimately, with erosion, if you can slow the water down, if you can get vegetation back on there, or maybe it is, your upstream that's being affected. If your pasture is on a high slope and you continually overgraze it or put a lot of grazing pressure on it, that can increase erosion. And so just going in and allowing that vegetation to grow back, grazing it in a way that that slows that water down, increases infiltration, and decreases the amount of runoff you have, it can certainly help with your erosion. So again, that's a very specific one. It's kind of short, but if you have something that's either highly erodible or actively eroding, you can put practices into place that count on that. Under predator control, we already talked about some exotic stuff that falls into habitat management. Feral pigs was in there. It can also fall into predator control here. And so there are going to be things that we see multiple times in multiple categories. Something to keep in mind is you can't double dip. If you're doing predator control by removing feral hogs here, you cannot take credit for that also in habitat management. So you have to pick where that's going to go and get credit for it in that one category. However, if you're doing feral hog control, even if it fits in multiple categories, if you already have a practice in habitat management, there's no sense in including it in there when you can put it under the predator control category. So that could be feral pig, it could be red imported fire ants, feral dog, feral cat control, brown-headed cowbird, that comes into play in the hill country. It could be grackle, starling, house sparrows. If you have an overabundance of raccoons and skunks and you're trying to manage for ground nesting birds or anything that can be predated by those species. Some of this rat snake control. If you're managing for white-tailed deer, probably not going to get credit for rat snake control because it's not a predator of white-tailed deer. But depending on what you're managing, what your target is, what your goals are, if you're putting up if you're putting up birdhouses for purple martins is what I'm trying to think of. Rat snakes may be a serious concern there. And so whatever your predator control is, you need to make it match what you're managing. So under feral pig control, trapping, hunting, aerial gunning, there is no minimum set for this. However, if you're gonna put that in your management practices, be sure that you somehow quantify what you're doing. I had a trap out for this many days. I caught this many pigs. We had a hunter that came in and shot this many, or we spent X number of days in a helicopter. As long as you can quantify it and say that I'm actively doing this, this is not just I randomly shot one pig because I saw it on my property. You need to be actively doing something to control that species. Under exotic fire ant control, this is one of those that'll catch you 1% of the infected area or 10 acres annually, whichever is more. So most of them say whichever is less. This one says whichever is more. And so this is not going out and just treating a fire ant mound that's in your backyard. This is a wide scale treatment of the entire block of property to try and maintain this. There's some commercial pesticides that are out there. If you want to go non-pesticide, you can treat fire ant mounds with boiling water. There's some interesting studies about that pouring a large amount of boiling water on that nest can kill the ants inside of it and minimize their spread. So there's some things to do with that if you want to treat it. A little more labor intensive, but it does not require chemicals. So under providing supplemental water, this may be marsh or wetland restoration or development. We saw this one already, again, something that hits multiple categories, but think about supplemental water if you need supplemental water. If you already have, if you have a piece of property that's got 3 stock ponds on it and you put in a water trough for white-tailed deer, you're probably not benefiting a whole lot from providing that supplemental water because it's already there. But if you don't have anything on your property at all, and you put in a little ground guzzler like you see on the right, then you can gain benefit from that. So it can be wells, it can be troughs, it can be windmills, overflow, spring development or enhancement. There's any number of things. There's in-ground troughs, rain catchment is one, tank troughs like you see that you fill up, rubber tubs. It can look any number of ways to truly landscape, but there is another way that you can look at this, and that's modification of your current watering systems for your target species. And so if you were managing for small mammals or you're managing for birds and you have, let's say, this water trough on the right, if you're managing for a songbird that's this big, it's not going to be able to access the water in that trough. But if you put a rock in it, if you put, let me see if another one of these does not have a picture. There we go. So if you put this ramp that goes down into it, here's a ramp that goes into it. These are steps going both up and down into the water. You can see steps there. So this is modifying your existing watering facilities to be able to accommodate small wildlife species. This trough on the right, you can see is literally brim full. It looks like it might be overflowing just a little bit. A little bit of overflow is going to put water on the ground that these wildlife species can use. Putting these ramps up and down into the water not only provides an access point for small mammals and birds, but also if you have a raccoon, if you picture this little dog in the picture, if he falls in the water and has no way to get out, then he's stuck in the water. If he has this nice little ramp or this ramp and he can just walk out the other side, then you've made that trough wildlife or small mammal friendly. And so these modifications, along with these different watering structures, can all be beneficial and they can all count. Another one up here, I don't know if I hit on, was a guzzler. It's actually a water catchment device that's out in your pasture. But again, keep in mind where you're located, keep in mind the watering facilities that you may already have, and how much water is around your property as to whether or not you'll benefit from these practices. So under providing supplemental food, this can be grazing management, which sounds counterintuitive. If you have cows out there, they're eating stuff that wildlife may eat, right? Yeah, possible. But with proper grazing management, you're also encouraging plant growth by removing some of that plant matter. That plant's going to grow back again. You may have the hoof action and whatnot that are encouraging forb growth, that are feeding your other wildlife either through directly eating the forbs or through the seeds that they produce. I keep using the term. I'm sorry if you don't know the term forb. Forbs are non-grass, non-woody herbaceous plants. They're your weeds that most people would consider weeds, but in the wildlife world, they're beneficial things, whether that, like I said, whether that's direct consumption or whether that's through eating the seeds that they produce, or whether that is through the insects that they're attracting that your bird species may be eating. So any number of benefits from grazing management that can provide supplemental food. It can be prescribed burning, range enhancements, food plots, feeders and mineral supplementations, managing tame pastures, fields, and croplands. And so if you are, let's say you've got a milo field out there and you leave a couple strips out there for wildlife, or you actually put food plots in the ground or put a protein feeder out there, whatever it is that needs to match the wildlife species that you are managing for. So one thing to think about is managing the habitat to increase the quality and quantity of naturally produced foods should be your primary objective. Okay, so if you can go manage the landscape, if you, whatever your practices may be, if you can put that practice on the landscape and it improves what's already there, is going to be your best bet. Providing artificial or supplemental food, such as feeders and food plots, is not a substitute for good quality habitat management. However, it can be used as part of a comprehensive management plan to benefit that wildlife species. And so, you know, if you're putting a bird feeder out there for your songbirds that you're managing for, perfectly fine. But if you can manage that habitat to produce the food rather than putting it out there from a sack, you're going to be that much better. So when we think about supplemental food, several considerations here. One is artificial food should not be provided to the extent that it will increase the number of animals to a level higher than the native habitat can adequately support. And so what this is saying is that if you're managing your land for, say, white-tailed deer, there's a certain number of animals that habitat can support. That's the carrying capacity of that land. If you're putting your supplemental food out truly as a supplement, something that your wildlife is benefiting from having out there on the land, it's great. But if you're using that as a food source to increase the number of animals on that property, is not a good thing, because if next week or next year you decide that you don't have that in the budget to feed those animals, you've falsely increased the carrying capacity of that land, and now you have an overabundance of wildlife. Also, when these animals are consuming these supplemental feeds, they're not stopping, they're not no longer eating what's out there on the landscape. They're still consuming that vegetation out there, so they're still putting pressure on your native vegetation. So think of it as only a true supplemental food source. Artificial food should not contradict other management practices objectives, like managing nutrition. That basically you don't want to put a food source out there on the ground like you see the raccoons and the pigs that artificially increases their food source. And so if you're putting protein out there for white-tailed deer, but you're actively feeding your feral hog population, then you're contradicting what your target is or what your goals are there. Grazing management, again, it's conservative stocking rates. Livestock grazing can complement most wildlife programs. A deferred rotation grazing systems, it provides adequate rest recovery periods. And so constant heavy grazing may be a negative for wildlife, but moderate grazing or even heavy stocking rates in a rotational grazing system can benefit your wildlife. Prescribed fire, we've already talked about. There's a lot of benefit that can come from prescribed fire. It puts nutrients back in the ground. It promotes plant growth. When we talk about fire, we're setting our successional stage back. Succession is a predictable change in plant communities over time. And so we know that if we burn, we're going to have some grass response right away, but we're also going to have that forb response, because forbs are one of the first things to come back. And so we're going to help provide that food source for those wildlife species. Under range enhancement, if you're going out there and you're planting stuff specifically that you know that these wildlife species will eat, whether that's grass with hard seed like your paspalums and stuff like that, or if you're planting forbs out there, then you know that those forbs are going to produce food for wildlife. Then that's a direct, you're providing supplemental food by doing these practices on the landscape. You can also introduce disturbance that promotes forbs. So mowing, disking, fire, grazing, we already talked about, but disking is one. It doesn't have to be disking a whole pasture. You can go out there, I don't have a picture of it. You can go out there and lightly disc, just disturb the soil, and you're going to see around here, you're going to see a ragweed response, you're going to see a sunflower response, you're going to see a croton or a goatweed response. All those things that people perceive as weeds are providing food, and they're providing that food source for those wildlife species. Under mowing and haying, You can do any number of things, only do part of an area per year if you're mowing it. In the picture here is a wheat field, and what we did was we went in and we baled strips of that wheat field to provide the wheat hay that we were looking for, but we left some of it for the dove species that we were targeting. And so we killed two birds, no pun intended, two birds with one stone there by baling some of it and leaving some of it for the wildlife. So strip mowing or disking, here's a picture of some fallow disking that they're doing. Again, this is just out there in the pasture, going out and disking strips through there. It doesn't have to be a straight line. It can be done with completely no pattern at all, just a random driving around the pasture to make this funny little design out there. And all that is going to increase edge. It's going to increase your for production on the property. In some areas, overseeding of native pasture with legumes is a practice that can be done. No till on cultivated lands, and so leaving some of that vegetation out there and not completely disking it under. Converting non-native pastures back to natives, feeders, food plots, anything that increases the quantity and the quality of the food source can be counted. Under food plots, a minimum of 1 acreage should be planted. They would like it to be cool season and warm season, providing it in both times of the year. One of the things to consider with food plots is when you need them the most is the times when they're the hardest to grow. When you need them, you can't grow them. When you don't need them, you can grow them. And so if you have a wet year and there's a lot of productivity and your food plot is just booming, is also the time of year that or also the year that you're probably also going to have a lot of native vegetation out there. So it can be a cool season annual mix, a warm season annual mix. It can be a mix of perennials. It can be stuff that provides food in the leafy vegetation. It can be stuff that provides seed for the wildlife as well. Feeders we've talked about a little bit. If you're going to put feeders out there, make sure that they're maintained, make sure that they stay full, make sure you're using them to truly provide that food source. If you're talking about white-tailed deer or free choice feeder, a minimum of 1 free choice feeder per 320 acres and a minimum of 16% crude protein. Again, this would be more thinking about white-tailed deer, but even if you're managing for songbirds, if you've got feeders out there on the landscape, if you keep them full, you can provide that food source for those birds. But if you've got 100 acres and you've got 2 small bird feeders on it that they're going to eat and the squirrels are going to get to, you're probably not adequately providing that food for those animals. Under providing supplemental shelter, this can look any number of ways. It can be truly putting a box out there that is shelter for them, bird houses, bat boxes, bee houses. This doesn't just mean honeybees. This can be native bee houses. Let's see if there's a picture. I don't think I have a picture of the bee houses, but you can do these little tubes that these carpenter bees will go utilize for nesting and whatnot. So it can be providing that. It can be providing brush piles. May or may not be the best management practice depending on where you are, what you're targeting. Fence line management. So by leaving some of these old fences that are grown up a little bit, you can potentially be providing supplemental shelter for these wildlife species. Hay meadow pasture cropland management we've talked about. By leaving some of this stuff out there, you can potentially be providing a supplemental shelter for wildlife. Just as one example, if you picture going out there and planting a dish strip of milo or Sudan that's going to grow up, it's going to provide a travel corridor for some of these wildlife species. It's going to provide shelter from aerial predators for your ground nesting birds while also providing a food source for those wildlife species. Half cutting trees is not something we typically do down here. What it is if you take a mesquite tree and you start sawing on it until it falls over, that tree is going to fall over, but half of that cambium is still going to be intact. And so the tree is going to continue to grow there on the ground. And so it's not completely killed the tree. It's providing a supplemental shelter that's there on the ground. We see it more in the northern parts of the state where their brush grows a lot slower. It's a lot harder to establish brush in areas that you would like to see it. Woody plant or shrub establishment. Again, in some areas we have too much brush, but in other areas, if you've got 100-acre coastal field that you're trying to convert back to wildlife, then a little bit of brush in there may not be a bad thing. So establishing some of those woody species is a practice that you can use. And then natural cavity or snag development. So that is basically going in and leaving. There was a picture early on. If you saw it, it was a dead tree that had a whole bunch of woodpecker holes in there. If you have dead snags or dead standing trees on your property, leaving those out there for wildlife can count as providing supplemental shelter, because eventually you're going to have those cavity nesting birds go in and use it, or you're going to have woodpeckers that create holes and whatnot in it. You see a picture of half cutting trees on the bottom left here. This is a bluebird box. This is an example of a juniper that was sheared off and left there to grow. What you'll see, especially if you're grazing cattle, is you'll see that cattle will graze all around this, but you'll have this little microculture, microclimate inside of this or micro ecosystem inside of this tree skeleton, because your grass is going to grow up that your cattle can't eat, and so you'll see wildlife species that use that as well. If you're going to put in things like bluebird boxes or provide that supplemental shelter, if you can provide some sort of a predator guard on it. Sometimes when we create these things, they're great and we do good things by providing this shelter for wildlife species, but we also kind of make it a predator buffet if you don't properly protect these things. And so when it comes to nest boxes, there's any number of species that use nest boxes, about 80 different bird species that can and will use it. Sometimes when you put them up, I've put up wood duck boxes before that never got used by wood ducks, but they were inhabited immediately by screech owls, eastern screech owls. And so we didn't reach our target of wood ducks, but we did provide shelter for a different species of wildlife out there. And so there's a lot of information. Allaboutbirds.org has a wealth of information. It talks about dimensions. It talks about what birds will use these nest boxes, how to put them into practice, and where to put them. Again, brush piles can be good depending on your specific situation, depending on what you've got. If it's like this juniper skeleton that you see on the ground, you know, that's something that's going to be there for a little bit. It's going to provide shelter, and then it's going to be gone. Leaving large brush piles like you see on the far right, bottom right, again, it can be beneficial, but you have to also think about what else you're providing shelter for. So if you're leaving that brush pile to provide shelter for bird species, but you're also encouraging, you know, snakes and other snakes and mesomammals to come in there, then you could be attracting your predators as well. And so again, just depends on what your target is. Fence line management, I mentioned just a little bit, leaving some of these fence lines, leaving that brush intact along that fence line. Obviously, if it's compromising the integrity of that fence, then you have to do something there. But if you can leave that brush, you're providing some of that habitat along that brush line. We're going to glance over this one because we've already kind of talked about it, but hay meadows, pastures, and cropland, leaving some of that out there for the wildlife to use rather than completely harvesting it or completely mowing everything. Here's a slide I was looking for under natural cavity or snag development. If you have these standing trees that are already dead, then you can just leave them out there. It requires a little minimum of 5 snags per acre on 5% of the acreage, and so it requires there to be a certain density. However, you can also create some of these snags if you really want to manage for these species by going out and girdling trees. So that's taking a chainsaw, it's cutting the outer cambium layer of that tree that's in essence going to kill the tree, but it's going to leave it as a standing dead tree, and so you can create these natural snags as well. So lastly, performing census counts or surveys. One of the requirements in Fort Bend County is that they ask that you include performing census counts or surveys as one of your practices. So why are surveys important? It's a vital prerequisite for many wildlife management techniques. Let's just say white-tailed deer. If you're going to go out there and manage your property for white-tailed deer, you need to know how many animals you have out there before you try to take on a population control method. If you're going out there and hunting to decrease your population, you need to know how many animals you have out there. It may provide knowledge of which species to focus on for management. If you don't know what's out there, you don't know what to manage for. It's an important and responsible harvest for selected game species. It provides a picture of the health and diversity of the environment. If you're managing for bobwhite quail, and there are no bobwhite quail out there currently, and you manage your place, and next year you have a covey or two, then you know that something that you're doing is beneficial. On the flip side, if you've got quail everywhere and you continue to manage it the way that you think that you're supposed to, and in year 5 you no longer have any birds, then maybe there's something going on that you need to reassess. So this can come in any number of ways: spotlight counts for white-tailed deer, aerial counts for white-tailed deer and quail. You have to have the right piece of property to do an aerial count. You also have to budget that in because helicopter time is not inexpensive. But it is a practice that you can use on your area. Daylight herd and wildlife composition count. So this is going out during dawn and dusk times and counting your wildlife or counting your deer. Harvest data and collection. This is something that you can look at. Antler size. You can look at body weights of the animals that you're harvesting. This doesn't just have to be on white-tailed deer. This can be on a quail population. If you go out there and you actively hunt your property, and you go out 1 year and you have 80% juvenile birds that you're harvesting, then you know that things are on the up and up. If you go out the next year and you have 80% adult birds, that means that you didn't have a very high increase in your population that year. Browse utilization survey shows you what's being utilized on the landscape. It gives you kind of a look at, even if it doesn't tell you how many animals or how many deer on your property, if you know that your deer are eating only your first and second choice plants, that's really good because your habitat's supporting that. If they're going down and they're eating your third choice plants, a lot of third choice plants, you know that you either have poor habitat conditions or too many animals on the property. Census and monitoring of endangered, threatened wildlife species, census and monitoring of non-game wildlife. Whatever is out there, there's a way to count it. There's a way to get some sort of an idea. And even if it doesn't mean, even if it's not a total number count. So if you're managing for native wildlife, native plant species on your place, going out and creating an inventory of those plants to know what's out there on the landscape and to see if that diversity is changing from year to year, whether up or down, is also a type of survey. So for large mammals, we talked about those. Vegetation, you've got plant composition, browse utilization. For birds, you can do point counts. That's sitting in one spot and either listening or watching for birds. Feeder counts, you can put up game cameras, nest box searches. So you can go out and let's say you have bluebird boxes, going out every couple of weeks and monitoring whether or not those nests are active. That's a type of survey. It's a type of, it's a way to monitor that population on your property. So on wildlife survey basics, I'll try to wrap this up because it's been about an hour now. A total count or a true census is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to conduct. And so I typically refer to everything as surveys. A lot of folks say census. A true census is counting everything. No survey method available for wildlife is 100% accurate 100% of the time. We know that most everything that we do underestimates wildlife, at least in the deer population. Whether that is stand counts, spotlight surveys, camera surveys, helicopter surveys, most all of them underestimate. It's best to conduct multiple surveys and compare the results. Law of averages, if you can do it 3 or more times, it's going to help you to weed out those days. You know, you may go out and listen for birds one day and not hear a single thing because the weather's off, but you go out 2 more times and there's birds everywhere. So which survey method do you use? It depends on what species you're interested in, how much time you have, how big of an area you're surveying, and what type of habitat do you have. Again, if you're in extremely dense oak canopy, then a spotlight or an aerial survey for deer is not a really good practice for you. But it all depends on what you're doing. It depends on what species you're targeting, what group of animals you're targeting, what resources you have available for you. So which practices, of all these things, which practices do you put into place? So we have to think about what are the limiting factors out there. Limiting factors, something that is the most limiting in your environment. Food, shelter, water, space are the 4 components of a habitat. If you have something, if there's only so much water on your place, then water is going to be your limiting factor. If there's no cover on your place and you need cover for that wildlife species, cover is going to be your limiting factor. And so for each activity, think about it and answer the following to yourself. What species are you targeting? How will your activities benefit that species, positively or negatively? How will you implement your chosen activities? When and how often? How much will be done, or how many acres will be affected? What is the intensity that you can or that you plan on doing for that practice? And where on the property will the activity be conducted? Show that on a map. Show when you submit this, especially in your annual report, show them where these practices are done. but have this in your mind before you take this on, to know, what am I doing? How am I going to approach that? And what resources do I have to make this possible? Again, we like to think about this not only, and preferably not as a primary objective is the decrease in taxes and the cost savings, but to look at this from the standpoint of wildlife and wildlife management. Can I put practices in place that are going to benefit the wildlife on my property? So with that, maybe went a little over on time, but here's my contact information. You can find, or you can reach me either by email or by phone. If I'm not your biologist, if you have land that is not in Wharton or Fort Bend counties, if you copy that address down there or Google TPWD find a biologist, you can look for your county biologist. In any county in Texas, your biologist will be able to answer all the questions that you may have, or be able to cover the same information that I just talked about. So with that, Philip, I think I'm done.
Sounds great. Clint, we sure do appreciate your time. Very knowledgeable in that area. And just want to open it up to anybody. Does anyone have any questions? You can either type it in or you can unmute and ask. It's this time is yours to do that.
I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my page, and I'm going to open the chat window, and I will put in my contact information in that chat window.
Okay. All right. So, and folks, don't forget, I also put in the chat, there is a survey. We would really appreciate you. You can click on it there where it's already in the chat box, or I'm going to be sending you an email here just momentarily as well. If you would fill that out, that is extremely helpful to us in our programming. We're able to know what other things is going to be, or subjects is going to be useful for you as a landowner. And stay tuned for the upcoming new year too. We've got a lot of neat things coming up that's going to be very, very informational. Property liability, eminent domain, fencing laws, right-of-way laws, a lot of information like that, and also just a lot of brush and weed management as well. If you have property large or small, we'll have a lot of information that can benefit you to manage that property well. So once more, any questions to bring Clint's way?
Absolutely.
There you go, Clint.
Yep. Sorry. In fact, let me look real quick. I think I have a PDF of this presentation I can throw into the chat window, and you can get it right now.
And Dustin, also, like we said before, we've recorded this program. So as soon as I get that link, I'll be happy to forward that to everybody, actually, so you can review it again if you need to. There you are.
So there may be a couple. Oh, you may have to go into the files section to get the.
Okay.
I thought it would pop up here.
There's okay. Well, there's your email address. Yeah.
Let me see real quick. Make sure y'all get this.
And Clint, also, I have everyone's email address. If afterwards, if you want to send that to me, I'll forward it on to everyone as well.
Okay. Yeah, we can
do that.
We can certainly do that.
Sounds good. Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you. Well, folks, without further ado, we're going to let you go. And by all means, get a hold of us anytime you need us. And we're happy to answer your questions on just a myriad of things. Clint is always available, either by way of email or contact us, and we can contact Clint, and he can answer your questions, or on any question that you might have. You may have a certain plant or an insect that you're not familiar with. Give us a call. Let us help you with that information as well. Okay. Well, Clint, we're gonna sign it off here. So thanks again, everybody. Y'all have a great and blessed day. Enjoy this wonderful weather. Looks like it's going to be with us for a little bit longer. So Until next time, folks, stay tuned. We'll be sending you other information as far as other programming and things that we're going to do. And please don't forget the survey. Y'all have a great day. Bye-bye.